Hi, and welcome to Progressive Podcast Australia. On the show today, we're covering the upcoming US election. And to join me to discuss this, I've got Jason Brownlee, politics professor in Austin in the US. Welcome back to the show, Jason.
Thanks, Nick. Nice to be back.
And yeah, it's a very busy time for me right now, but I thought it was definitely worth covering this election as much as I'm not really excited about either candidate who's likely to win. I do think it's a very important issue to cover. I guess maybe to start off in a very general sense, you're obviously a politics professor and study this stuff academically, but I guess you're also just a person living in the US as well, and very turbulent time. How are you feeling about everything now, again, as a politics professor, but also someone who lives in the country as well?
Yes, well, I live in the state of Texas. I've lived here for 19 years, and it's a very Republican-dominated state, a very right-wing state. It really led the country on the abortion ban issue, really putting it forward even before Roe versus Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court in 2022. And it has unfortunately been a kind of innovator and leader in lots of right-wing causes. So in a way, living in Texas is kind of a constant experience of what it's like when Republicans end up in control of our national government and the presidency as well. So in that sense, I would say, just I'm maybe a little bit conditioned to prepare for the worst. But yeah, I've been following the election and definitely also trying to get like not just a hot take on it, but I try to get a longer kind of historical and structural perspective on it to the extent that one can do that while being in the moment and and following it in real time under with other commitments. So yeah, with the perspective one can have from the present. But yeah, it's definitely on my mind.
Absolutely. I thought maybe a useful place to start, considering that yeah, whatever happens, well, Biden will no longer be there, but perhaps a bit of an assessment of how Biden has gone in his term. I've picked up
Mhm.
little, things about Biden. I was telling you this before we started, but Katie watches a lot of Seth Myers, Late Night with Seth Myers, or whatever that show's called. And I did watch the Biden interview on Seth Myers with Katie. And yeah, what really stood out to me was really how much he buys into every single myth associated with the US really strongly. And there's an article we'll perhaps get onto later on in this show, perhaps that you passed on, Who's Afraid of Democracy by Steve Fraser. And he mentioned comedian George Carlin's observation. They call it the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it, which I thought was quite good. But yeah, it's sort of that like, American exceptionalism. America is somehow like different or should be treated to other countries. Like American imperialism is a good thing. Americans spreading peace around the world. Also, after Trump was shot as well, this wasn't on Seth Meyers, but just his kind of talking, saying like America is a country that is against violence, and this is totally against what everything is America is about. And I was like, really, like globally, like internationally, maybe not so much. Like
Mm.
U.S. wars overseas, and I think you've said similar things before as well. That it seems like he is a true believer of those things. It's not like he's got this really radical progressive agenda that's been hijacked by the corporations as kind of like what they're pushing him to do is what he wants to do anyway. Having
Right.
said that, I know some of your takes and other leftists, at least initially, I don't know if this is still the case, but actually he'd probably been a bit further left than perhaps people had expected as well. I don't know if that has continued, but yeah, what's your assessment of Biden's presidency?
Yes, well, I think everything that you said is true in terms of him subscribing to American exceptionalism and really looking past America's ongoing crimes including our role in the war, and if we could call it a war, I mean the slaughter that's going on in Gaza, very likely, genocide. We'll hear eventually from the International Court of Justice on that. And just right off the news last night, I was watching PBS, and they had coverage of Gaza and what was going on in Gaza. And then the top of the story, as they went to the general news, was Biden issuing this apology to Native Americans for a terrible program that involved removing kids from their parents and putting them in these schools. And it's just part of a long history of repression and civil rights violations, civil liberties violations when it comes to the treatment of indigenous peoples in the United States, and First Nations, as we would call them, and just the disconnect between and the irony between Biden making such a big deal about being the first president to apologize to Native Americans, and then for crimes that have been committed 100 years ago, and then meanwhile being completely involved in backing Israel to the hilt when it comes to crimes being committed right now against another indigenous people, the people of Palestine. So very much a subscriber to American exceptionalism. I think in terms of foreign policy, one of the things that has stood out in terms of him being, we could say, less harmful than his immediate predecessors is that he was willing to complete the withdrawal from Afghanistan, even though that was going to always be chaotic and basically reflect badly on whatever president was in office at the time. And unfortunately, he didn't get our remaining combat forces out of Syria or Iraq. We have something around like 3,000 spread across both countries in missions that are absolutely no longer necessary, if they even were ever necessary. They're technically there on an anti-ISIS mission. The ISIS caliphate is long since defeated, but they're still there, basically having kind of tit for tat with Iranian proxies. So he hasn't rolled that back. Domestically, he's been, and I get this from some real strong leftist intellectuals like Adolph Reed Jr. The assessment is that in terms of labor rights, he's probably the most pro-labor president we've had in a long time. I mean, perhaps ever. He made some very important and strong appointments to the National Labor Relations Board, which is in charge of setting up whether unions get set up and then adjudicating when there are disputes between unions and employers. In terms of his language being kind of pro-union, that has been backed up by substance in some areas. And there would be some other areas in domestic policy where he's done less harm, let's say, and maybe in some ways had some improvements. I think if he was not so incapable of like running a decent, functioning campaign, then it would be reasonable to expect him, to go for a second term, and expect that he would a second term of Biden would be preferable to the Republican alternative of a second term of Trump. But yeah, overall, I would say he's, coming after 2 terms of George W. Bush, 2 terms of Obama, 1 term of Trump. I'd say Biden was better than any of those 3. So, a relative improvement. But unfortunately, I think for some of the structural issues which may be behind a Trump comeback, Biden didn't do what he needed to in ways that a Bernie Sanders or a more serious leftist president could have done. And so the country is still in a real terrible situation in terms of the basic political direction that we're going.
Yeah, and I did want to mention as well, we are recording this on YouTube as well. So if anyone is listening to the podcast and would like to see the video version, we'll put a link to that as well. I did want to maybe just elaborate on that a little bit. We can put a link to your article that covered this too. But in your article about Afghanistan, which you've recently visited as well, which was interesting. But do you want to elaborate on why withdrawing from Afghanistan, you view it as a net positive, as much as, I guess, once you're in that situation, there was no good options in a way, but it was the best option among the options, I guess?
Yeah, so I start when it comes to basically any country in the world, but especially countries in the global South. I start from a pretty kind of classical perspective that's grounded in international law and the idea that countries have a right, political communities have a right to self-determination. And that means them being able to make their own decisions, regardless of whether I, as an outsider, approve of that, regardless of what my opinion is, or regardless of what other countries think of that. And I thought that the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan, starting from fall 2001, was a violation of Afghan sovereignty and absolutely an obstruction to Afghan self-determination. So I was against the Afghanistan war in fall of 2001, which politicians like Obama refer to as the good war, or even some like sort of anti-interventionist intellectuals like Andrew Bacevich refer to as the good war. Like that's the one we definitely should have done. Iraq, no, we shouldn't have done that. We definitely should have done Afghanistan. No, I would have said we should have used like international law enforcement mechanisms to go after anyone who's connected with 9/11, but not wage war on another country. So, once the occupation begins, I was absolutely for withdrawing as soon as possible, and I was pleasantly surprised, quite surprised, when Donald Trump in 2020, February 29th of 2020, just before COVID really came to the U.S. and things started shutting down, he through his Secretary of State agreed to a peace deal with the Taliban that would allow for the withdrawal of U.S. troops within the next year. Basically the next year. He put the final withdrawal date on the other side of the election and the presidential inauguration. So, which is a kind of convenient way of kicking the can and kicking the real decision moment into what he might have, at that point expected would be his second term, or into the term of some other presidency. So we don't know if he got reelected. Would he really have followed through on it? I'm not sure. But anyway, that was that was kind of the task that was left to Joe Biden when he was inaugurated in January of 2021. Would he complete the withdrawal that spring, or would he stick around indefinitely, as some people wanted? And he extended the timeline. So he broke the agreement. He extended the timeline to September 11th was basically what he put down. He said, we're going to be out by the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. And then the final withdrawal, really came together in August, and U.S. troops were out by the end of August of 2021. And so I supported that, just because, again, getting back to the fundamentals here, Afghans should be able to determine their own political destiny, and without a foreign military presence tipping the scales for one side or another. So,
all right. Yeah, I did want to get back to, and you've touched on this already, actually, but I was curious about the shift from, Biden-Harris to Harris-Waltz, and whether that is going to lead to, a left shift, a right shift, or much the same. Based on what you've said so far, it sounds like perhaps a shift to the right, if anything. I did want to briefly mention as well, I was listening to Ezra Klein. I don't know if you listen to Ezra Klein's stuff from New York Times.
When people recommend specific episodes, I will listen to them.
Yeah. So he was saying that in terms of why Harris, this was a while back, but why Harris was seen as really popular and then had kind of fallen out of favor. And this was like before all this stuff happened, but like why she was at one point not seen as a front runner to take over from Biden. And he was saying that when she came in, she was kind of a law and order kind of Democrat, and been a prosecutor and that kind of thing. But then the political moment that she was in was like there'd been Black Lives Matter had been really mainstream and sort of widely supported, and they sort of tried to rebrand her as sort of this progressive person, which is she kind of got in on the opposite, kind of more the right of the Democratic Party. But either way, it seems like, it seemed like there wasn't any discussion or any serious discussion about having anyone else take over from Biden. It seems like she's been somewhat popular. But yeah, I was wondering, yeah, Waltz, I'm even less familiar with in terms of his politics. But yeah, what do you think again? Will it be a change in either direction, or do you think it'll be much the same as what Biden was doing?
I mean, well, spoiler alert. I mean, right now I don't think they're going to win,
True,
but
true.
I
Yeah, yeah,
we'll come back to
yeah,
that.
yeah.
But I would, at the time that Biden stepped aside and Harris was became the presumptive nominee, I supported that shift. I thought it made sense. I thought it would have been chaos to start a new Democratic primary. I thought like she has an electoral mandate, having already been uh, chosen by the American people as the number two to someone who was pushing 80 when he was first elected. So in that sense, that it would have been very like weird and would have resulted in kind of a total lack of confidence of where the party was going if you went for someone else. In terms of her politics, yeah, I would say, we've spoken a little bit about how Biden is probably a little to the left of let's say Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, and I would probably on the spectrum put of the kind of mainstream Democratic Party, I would put Kamala Harris somewhere there as well. I mean, she was prosecutor, she was in California, she was a senator from California, and so she was able to take more more liberal or left-leaning positions than, let's say, senators from more contested states or more centrist states. And in the Democratic primary, she didn't back in the 2016 race, she didn't, or I should say 2020 race, she didn't stay in for very long in the primary. I mean that primary was really going on, really in 2019, and I think she participated in some debates, but she didn't actually even stay in until like the first actual primary uh, elections, as far as I can recall, or she didn't get any delegates. But she was a little bit like to the left of Biden at that point. But these are pretty nuanced differences. I thought Tim Walz has a little bit of like a Bernie Sanders kind of vibe to him. I like the fact I mean, I think his background is, I mean, basically the Democrats need more people like Tim Waltz. I mean, people who are not your standard like university educated and like with a lot of post university education as well, kind of overeducated, let's say, politicians, professional politicians. He kind of had a career before getting into politics at a relatively late stage in his life, after being a high school teacher as well as serving in the National Guard. And yeah, I think he has not, after the first few weeks of the Harris Waltz campaign, he has not performed very well. But overall, if they do end up losing, I know there'll be a lot of blaming the two of them and wondering, oh, should she have picked someone else, or should the Democratic Party have picked someone other than Kamala? And I actually think the obstacles for the Democrats this year were nearly insurmountable for any candidate, given the political economy situation that they've set up in the country. I mean, going back quite a ways, but certainly it's been exacerbated in the 2000s during the times even when they've had power, especially like the Obama era, and how Obama didn't respond strongly enough to the 2008 financial crisis and the Great Recession when he came into power, and when he came to office in 2009. He was not aggressive enough in really delivering a massive stimulus and support package for lower income Americans. And also, I think Biden probably hasn't done enough to help working class Americans as well, even though at the level of policies on unions, in terms of the intersection of the federal government and unions, he's been better for labor than other presidents.
Yeah, I wanted to turn now to a sort of familiar conversation we've had a bunch of times, and there's been similar discussions we've had in an Australian context of like our Labor Party being perhaps somewhat equivalent to the Democrat Party, like a centre left-ish party, but sometimes having right-wing policies, and then it comes to that debate of voting for like the lesser of two evils versus like perhaps we get into third parties and independents and that kind of thing as well. But just one specific example I saw on Twitter or X. So this is from December 2023, so a while ago, but I think it speaks to these ongoing issues. So this is a CBS News story. Breaking, the White House signals it's open to hardline immigration policies to convince Republicans to back Ukraine aid. And then someone commented on that at Sean_vids. Was the sort of their comment or critique of this, that it's really important to still support Biden while he does things like this, because otherwise Trump could get in and do things like this, which I thought was quite a good comment. And yeah, again, similar
Right.
conversations. Yeah. And so yeah, and you've already raised plenty of
Well,
sort of left critiques of Biden already, but yeah, I know. Yeah, with all those similar disclaimers, you advocating for voting for Hillary Clinton, going back, and yeah, as much as you'd campaign for Sanders and everything. But yeah, how are you feeling about that question this time around?
yeah. So I voted every time I had a chance to vote for Sanders, I voted for Sanders.
Hmm.
But then in the general, I voted for Hillary and voted for Biden, and I voted early last week for Kamala.
Hmm.
So which I really see at this point as kind of like harm mitigation. I mean, like I structurally, in terms of inequality and in terms of a lot of the issues I care about. I mean, you could go down the line, but definitely wealth redistribution and social safety net and reproductive rights. I just think all of that, unfortunately, is going to get worse over the next 4 years. Under Kamala, I think it will get worse less. It will get less quickly than under Trump. Um, and with respect to let's see, the other part of your question. Sorry, remind me. I lost my train of thought there for a second.
Yeah, I guess,
Then,
yeah, that question of vote, and I guess I will say about like people voting. I guess what do people to the left
oh
of the
yeah,
Democrat
I
Party
know.
do? Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Okay, no, I know where I wanted to go because you had that great quote of the guy who's like, they're going a hard line on immigration so that Trump won't have to go hard line on immigration.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, unfortunately, at this point, yeah, if you look at their policies on immigration uh, and their policies on like basically Wall Street and wars, and you see Kamala and Waltz like embracing Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney. It's basically a vote between like the old like George W. Bush Republican Party or the new Trump Republican Party. And so like between those two, I technically voted for a Democrat, but really in terms of the policies they're promoting, it's a vote for the old Republican Party. And to the extent that voters, in I'm not in a swing state, but anyway, I vote anyway. But to the extent that voters in swing states like Michigan, look at these two choices and they say, no, I'm not going to vote for the equivalent of the George W. Bush Republican Party, and that's now in the Democratic Party because of Gaza, because of them not doing enough for reproductive rights while Biden was actually in office, for them having basically a hardline immigration policy, and for a number of reasons, I totally, I mean, I guess would respect that decision. I think that's a very ethically defensible position to take. I mean, in a way, I feel like yeah, there would be less harm if Kamala were to be elected, but at the same time, I mean, given how Biden has handled things, Biden and Harris have handled things with Gaza. I mean, they do kind of deserve to lose for that. There's kind of a karma, I think. Yeah, but yeah, that's the situation we're in. Two-party system, and I think people were taking a little more of an abstract position, like in the year 2000 with voting for Ralph Nader. And then when that ended up looking so consequential afterwards, I mean, we can get into whether that actually, changed the election or not. But afterwards, like 4 years later, like Chomsky, Michael Moore, they were all like, no, you got to vote. You got to vote for John Kerry, even though he's there. You can't vote for. You got to stop George W. Bush from getting second term. That was not successful, but that's basically the philosophical position I've taken since.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And again, I also sympathize and understand those who are voting third party or independent or not at all. And yeah, I feel like for those who do have that position of being to the left of the Democratic Party, you're gonna have to sort of make a decision that you're either way not going to be particularly happy with. But I think probably the biggest issue is more that structural reform. So in Australia, for example, we've got a Green Party who I think have done really good policies around public housing, but also on Gaza and many other issues. And so you can have your protest vote and still have your vote flow onto the lesser of two
Mm,
evils as well. So I feel like that is probably a bigger, more important discussion, like reforming the system to something similar to Australia rather than what individuals do around that question. Although, yeah, both are important too. But I guess I was also interested in your thoughts around any third party independent. So yeah, there's the Green Party, Jill Stein, I believe, and Cornell West is also running as independent. So yeah, do you have any thoughts on their campaigns or policies or anything like that?
I have not followed them closely, so I
Yep.
might see the occasional interview with them
Hmm.
on on Democracy Now or some other outlet. But I yeah, I found Cornell West's arguments and scholarship to be very helpful in some areas over the years, and sometimes I've found Jill Stein to be insightful. But I haven't given they haven't been even serious contenders as third party entrants this year.
Hmm.
The only one who was a real potentially consequential third party candidate was RFK Jr., and then he dropped out in basically this summer, I believe, and endorsed Trump. So, but it looked like he could have gotten 5% of the vote or something in some states, and potentially in swing states have tipped the and been sort of like a spoiler candidate for whichever side, if he was taking away from. I think in some cases he could have potentially been a spoiler for Trump. I think he was drawing more from Trump than from Harris.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I haven't followed it closely either. I think one sort of slogan or like quote that Cornell West was running with was its choice between I think World War and Civil War or something like that. In terms of like the Democrats have got the imperialism and Trump has got the sort of demonization of immigrants and stuff like that. And so I thought that was absolutely like a fair argument from both sides, like in terms of his critiques of both. But yeah, there are those practical issues you've touched on as well. And I guess to return to another issue we covered on the show a while back around the 2020. So me and another regular guest in the US, Nick, who does the podcast Pink Spots, but we covered this was post the 2020 election, and we did a show called are the Republicans the party for workers? Because they've kind of rebranded themselves in that way. As you say,
Mm.
older school Republicanism, like George Bush definitely was not, as far as I know, doing that messaging. But I've got a quote from Ted Cruz at CPAC in 2021. This was, I heard from Late Night with Seth Myers, of course. But so the Republican Party is the party of steel workers and construction workers and pipeline workers and taxi cab drivers and cops and firefighters and waiters and waitresses and the men and women with calluses on their hands who are working for this country, was his quote. Which again is not the traditional, not the traditional Republican thing, but yeah, I guess as you've mentioned, that like the Democrats have perhaps abandoned to that sort of demographic to some extent, although he did mention Biden having like some policies in support of unions. But how do you feel about that? Yeah, I guess there's the thing of like the rhetoric versus reality. But yeah, any thoughts on that sort of rebrand within the Republicans to say that they're actually the party for workers?
Yeah, well, it says a lot about how much ground the Democrats have lost that someone can make those kinds of claims with a straight face. Now, obviously, you can't be a party for workers when you oppose unions. You can't be a party for workers when you praise how Elon Musk wants to fire people who disagree with him and how he should be able to do that. You can't be a party for workers when you have at will employment in basically Republican run states like Texas. And I mean, you fundamentally cannot, they are fundamentally not on the side of workers if we think of that as meaning anything like shifting the bargaining terms in favor of the employee, and sometimes contrary to the interests or preferences of the employer or the owners. So I think that's pretty transparently false. I think the challenge and the real problem is that while they're absolutely opposed to organized workers, they can support industries like, let's say, the industries that are especially bad for climate change, fossil fuel industries, um, maybe some other type like timber industries, basically industries where there's some serious environmental externalities and negative externalities that we would want to be mitigated or taken into account when the commodities are being priced and when we're thinking about like making profit in these industries. The Republicans have managed to be the party that defends those industries, and I think they win substantial worker support for taking those positions. And then when the Democrats, so this is like, I mean, we'll just take fracking as a key example. I mean, 8 years ago, Hillary Clinton was saying things like, we're going to put a lot of people in the coal. Actually, let's move from fracking to coal for a second. I think she said we're going to put a lot of people in the coal industry out of work. Or like for fracking, they would say, well, they're going to have to have training and learn some new type of job, when they're in their 40s or 50s. Similar things going on with manufacturing, where the Democrats, very much like old school, like just like Republicans, will basically preach the gospel of neoliberalism and just sort of say, like, look, everybody, we've all studied macroeconomics. We know these jobs are eventually going to go away. So you've just got to sort of take a hit, because the efficient thing for the United States to do will be to make electric cars, not gas cars. The efficient thing for workers to do is move out of these depopulated areas and just come to the cities where the jobs are. So what Trump and his specific brand is saying is something different from conventional Republicans, because conventional Republicans would also be saying that same kind of thing. But Trump instead says, like, no, we've got a really big economy. We can protect these industries. We can raise tariffs. We can get into like trade wars with other countries. And so he's willing to sort of tear up the Milton Friedman like playbook in a way. Now he's not going to do it in a way that's going to ultimately structurally shift power in favor of workers, but it could, save a factory here or there. It could send a signal to an investment capital that, yeah, the conventional, combustion engine still needs to be made in the U.S. We're not going to replace everything with electric cars. And this type of kind of protectionist rhetoric has resonated. I mean, there's data from the last couple of elections that's showing that. So that's definitely not pro workers, but in these kind of bad for the environment industries that one would hope would be eventually phased out, he's actually he's gesturing towards more of a safety net and more of a lifeline than the Democrats often are when they just talk about job retraining, or you're just going to have to we need to shut these industries down, or we need to increase, fines and make these industries not economically viable.
Yeah, and again, going back to that article you sent through, "Who's Afraid of Democracy" by Steve Fraser, was talking about how there's the rise of the sort of blue collar working class in the US like rose really quickly and also fell really quickly. And I feel like those like Democrats particularly and many sort of more liberal voices in the US perhaps haven't taken that seriously as like losing something. And again, I think Trump rhetorically speaks to that. As you say, some policies in certain ways might actually speak to that. But yeah, I guess also yeah, I think like the Trump serving at McDonald's recently, it's like it's much more symbolic of like I like McDonald's, therefore I'm for McDonald's workers, even though he has like attacked yeah, raising the minimum wage and those kind of things that would actually yeah, increase the or make lives better for those people working at McDonald's, for example. So yeah, I agree that it is mostly symbolic, and also other policies like when he was in place. Like I've read an article a while ago: is Trump neoliberal or not? And as you say, in some ways he meaningfully isn't. Like he has nationalist economic policies which actually are not just a rhetorical but are actually a break from neoliberalism, but in other ways he's very much consistent with neoliberalism in terms of supporting cuts to welfare, supporting reduced regulations on business, those kind of things. So it's sort of a two-sided story, but I yeah, appreciate your thoughts. But yeah,
Well,
go
on the
ahead.
McDonald's, just a
Yeah, yeah.
couple of things to build off of that. On
Yeah.
McDonald's, apparently part of that sort of spectacle and publicity stunt was to undermine Kamala Harris's biography that she had worked at McDonald's.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
today, he was interviewed by Joe Rogan yesterday, and I
Oh,
listened
okay.
to
Yeah.
it today.
Yeah.
And he's claiming that she never worked at McDonald's, so that
Hmm.
he has now worked at McDonald's more than Kamala Harris has.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah, and then I think more broadly, a way to look at a sort of procedural democracy, especially in a two-party system like the United States. I mean, for a while now has been that you have two parties that are competing on behalf of different wealthy sectors of the population. So you have different kind of industries that are competing. And that, like, let's say in the 1990s, like Clinton gets elected and that's better for high tech. Whereas if George W. Bush would have been elected, that would have been better for like traditional, like, I don't know, petrochemical industries. And so it's a competition about like which of the basically the owners of industry, which owners of industry are going to really have a seat at the table and have more of a voice relative. I mean, nobody's going to be totally excluded from the bargain, but some are going to get a bigger slice of the pie than others. And I think what Trump is doing with some of this, yeah, like anti-neoliberal talk, is he's kind of favoring industries that might not otherwise get a seat at the table, or favoring the captains of those industries. There's a So I mean, sometimes like he sometimes fixates on as a areas that would, yeah, otherwise be subject to like a lot of government regulation and might not be very profitable. Like he's been a big promoter. I don't know much about sports, but he's been a big promoter of UFC, Ultimate Fighting Club, which was like kind of, they couldn't get on TV much, and it was always like it was traditional boxing and these sports, and then like UFC getting on was really big when they could like break those barriers. So that's just an example of him like being a little bit like iconoclastic in terms of what industries are allowed to participate in, I guess, what we would, think of as sort of the oligarchy of neoliberalism.
Absolutely. Let's turn now to who will win. I know you've sort of you've buried this up front, but yeah, I guess why as well. But yeah,
Yeah. So, I I don't know what my record is of making predictions on the podcast. It's probably not very good. So,
yeah.
in this time, I'm predicting what I hope does not happen. So, I'm either right or I'm happy, I guess, in a couple, or relatively happier. But um, you know, for the first couple months of the Harris Waltz ticket, or hasn't even, well, at least the first month, let's say, there was a lot of momentum for her. I mean, going through the Democratic convention, but then after the convention, it really stalled out. And whereas I thought for the first few weeks, she was really showing a kind of energy and appeal that could have kept growing and growing. She seems to have slipped back into more of a very carefully calibrated campaign mode. Not quite as like cringe as like Hillary Clinton or some of these others, but I mean, still like just doesn't feel like authentic and feels like very scripted. Apparently, she's turned down Joe Rogan and will not do an interview with him, which I think is a complete like self goal. I mean, like it's just like an unforced error to not take that opportunity. But if you listen to, I mean, I don't recommend you guys listen to the 3 hour interview between Rogan and Trump, even at accelerated speed. But I did it because I just and I couldn't imagine Kamala Harris going on with Joe Rogan for 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, she's been even in very favorable, sympathetic formats. She's just not really created a strong message. And for that reason, so getting back to your question, I mean, for that reason, her momentum stalled. And as of early October, it started to look like Trump was not only narrowing the gap, but even getting slightly ahead in some of the swing states. And so just as a reminder, we're dealing with electoral college, which has 538 electoral votes. So the winner needs to get up to 270. If for some reason both candidates got 269, it would be a tie. But a tie is a very low probability event this year. But right now, Trump is set to get somewhere in the realm of like 312 electoral college votes because he's a little bit ahead across multiple polls, or at least I should say across the average of polls in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. This is the so-called blue wall, the states that Kamala Harris has to take if she wants to get to 270. And here's where it gets though. Here's where I'm like even more. So the liberal mainstream like liberal take the past week has been, oh, it's really close. It's going to be a nail biter. It's going to go down to the wire. But we have two past elections now, presidential elections, where Trump significantly outperformed his poll numbers ahead of time. So if it looks neck and neck, he's probably ahead by like 2-3 percentage points, maybe in these swing states, and maybe even nationally. It's not impossible for him to actually win the popular vote this time, as well as the electoral college vote. The electoral college vote is what he has to win, and he lost the electoral college vote in 2020 and lost the popular vote in 2020. He lost the popular vote in 2016, but he won the electoral college in 2016. Most people who expect a Trump victory this year would say, yeah, he'll do it in electoral college, but he won't do it in the popular vote. The popular vote, that's a cosmetic sort of bonus thing. That's just icing on the cake. But I think he could actually do it in the popular vote too. If the polls are anywhere near as off as they were before. And just a quick word on why they were off before and why I think they're going to continue to be off is Trump appeals to voters who, I guess one way of putting it is voters who don't tend to answer surveys, and they tend to be more, let's say, politically reclusive, or they keep their cards close to the chest. And pollsters have not figured out a way, or at least they hadn't in 2020, figured out a way to sort of capture the data on these kind of elusive Trump voters.
Yeah, interesting. I definitely agree that it is a mistake for Harris to not go on Rogan. I know Bernie Sanders went on Joe Rogan and he got a lot of pushback for that, which I really didn't understand because I feel like Joe Rogan, his politics are a bit all over the place and his voters are just, I mean, he reaches so many people, but also they're not clearly Republicans or Democrats. There'd be like a mix of both of those and many who are undecided. And I just think it's such a important audience to reach, actually, because you need to reach beyond, just people who are vote blue no matter who or whatever, which it definitely isn't. But
Right, exactly. No,
yeah,
I just want to underline that point
yeah.
because, she went on Fox News as like, okay,
Mhm.
she's going to speak to some Fox viewers. This would be, if you think going on Fox News is smart, this is 10 times smarter than that, because where
Absolutely.
she's
Yeah.
really getting crushed by Trump is among young white males, and that's Joe Rogan's like main audience. And so she'd have the microphone, she would speak, and in the Trump interview, Rogan remained very open to having her on, and was, even
Mm,
though Trump was sort of goading him into saying, "Oh, you shouldn't have her on, you shouldn't," he was like, "No, I want to have her on. We could have a
mm.
conversation. I'd like things that, of course, I mean, he cares about ratings, right? He wants to have everybody on. Anyone
Yeah.
who has that, I mean, kind of platform at the moment. So, yeah, it's unfortunate. And again, it shows a kind of like a willingness, or sort of a reticence to get outside of the safety zone and really speak to voters who still need to be convinced. I've observed this with Democrats. I mean, going back definitely 2016 and earlier, and just also in conversations with liberal friends of mine or colleagues. And this is one of the benefits of being in a state like Texas, actually, is that I've just noticed that they don't feel, I don't know, comfortable, like actually trying to make arguments to impartial audiences and
Mm.
try to persuade people who are not already primed to be sympathetic to what they're saying. And if you can't do that, you're going to have trouble winning elections. If you're only like preaching to the choir, and she's about to do that in a massive way this week, because she's going to have her closing argument for the campaign is going to be an address she's delivering where Trump spoke on January 6th of 2021. So this is her closing thing, like, remember January 6th,
Mm.
Trump is a threat to democracy. And it's just it's just really an argument that has not resonated.
Mm.
And I think and I just kind of think it's a lame argument too, because it's like you're basically saying uh, you've got to, like, you can't vote for Trump, and I'm the only other major candidate, so you have to vote for me by default. Like, that's not that's not a way to win friends and influence people, and it's not a way to win elections. And also, if she was having like a dialogue with someone, imagine she's like, well, if you elect Trump, he's going to be an authoritarian, and we might lose our democracy. I could see an ordinary voter being like, yeah, I don't know about that. What else have you got for me? And the Democrats have nothing else.
Mm.
There's nothing. Like, I mean, Trump, like in the Joe Rogan, like, at least it's complete BS, but at least he says like, oh, I care about the farmers. The farmers are so great. I mean,
Mm.
he gets a mention. The farmers get a mention in Trump's rhetoric.
Yeah.
You don't, like, he throws these I mean, his pablums, I guess, are, if people are only going to get pablums, they would rather get pablum from Trump
Yeah.
than pablum from the Democrats, who are talking about fascism and this kind of overheated rhetoric. When people look back and they're like, well, he was already president once. He didn't lock Hillary Clinton up. Like, he's kind of exaggerates. And on Rogan today, on Rogan yesterday, I listened to it today. He said, like, yeah, this will be my last term. And Rogan's like, yeah, you can't run again. He's like, yeah, this will be my last term as president. And um, so I'm not, in terms of this like hovering hypothetical about the U.S. becoming authoritarian or a dictatorship. I'm never one for complacency. You could put that on any country, because the creation of authoritarianism or an actual authoritarian regime is it's always a prospect. I mean, if you have a serious enough emergency that people just are willing to discard their liberties and just put their full trust in government and just kind of accept the creation of a dictatorship, sure, that can happen. We don't want to say that it's never going to happen. But I think in terms of the conditions within the United States when it could have happened, they were far more ripe in the post 9/11 months, when people were rallying behind George W. Bush, including like lifelong Democrats, supporting the war in Afghanistan, supporting the Patriot Act. being fine with the creation of Guantanamo, which is still operating, than in recent years. I think the Democrats have just they haven't persuaded me on that, and I studied authoritarianism, and I just don't think that that argument is doing much for the kinds of voters we were talking about earlier, who are in like these sort of conventional industries that end up with negative environmental externalities and that should be sort of phased out. And they have acute concerns about job insecurity, as well as more general people having concerns about inflation and food prices and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I don't want to keep going on about Joe Rogan, but I do want to say it is sort of a puritanism, the idea like Bernie Sanders going on Joe Rogan somehow makes him like less pure or something like that. But again, I think it is a really good opportunity because I remember at one point, I don't know if this is still the case, but Joe Rogan said his favorite guest ever was Cornell West, which was kind of interesting. So I think if I kind of understand Harris not going on a far right thing where she's just going to be yelled at the whole time and not even get to say anything. But I do actually think Joe Rogan would give her a fair opportunity to actually say what she's about. And as you say, that's got to be beyond just the person I'm opposing, I'm running against is bad. What have you got that's good? What is your alternative you're offering, which has been lacking?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
If I could tag onto that,
Go ahead.
yeah, I mean the purity politics are just terrible for Democrats. I mean, it's like you can cancel people, you can cancel major, figures, you can get Al Franken to resign his Senate seat or whatever. You can cancel people, but you can't cancel voters. And when you when you send out a signal that basically they should be self-canceling because they're like not, their morality is deficient in some way, they're just gonna like either stay home or vote for the other candidate. And by the way, just one thing about this Joe Rogan in terms of substance. I mean, I have to say, like, there's some points in his interview with Trump where I was like, wow, this is like two fifth graders discussing a very complicated topic with like 20 times the confidence they should have. And it's just like they're just all over the place with talking about like whether we should be using pesticides or I mean, just anything. It's completely ridiculous. So I recommend that anyone listening to Rogan should basically think of it as a conversation taking place between like two people on, I don't know, on Survivor or some reality TV show. It's like they may occasionally have moments of brilliance and insight, but more generally, you're just getting an impression of the people and kind of how they see the world. And do not like consult your medical professionals before going and your financial advisor before taking anything off those programs.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that is a good disclaimer. Yeah, I don't want to be, yeah, like pro Joe Rogan. I think I have listened to a few episodes here and there for specific reasons when like there's been a guest I'm interested in. And yeah, I just don't think, I feel like he's perhaps caricatured a bit on the left as like an outright fascist, where I think he's more
Yeah,
someone who
yeah.
is a casual racist here and there, is he misunderstands free speech to mean like, oh, this is oppositional, therefore I have to elevate this above all other people I could have on my big platform. I just think sometimes how bad he is can be exaggerated on the left, at least from my listening of the show anyway. But
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. Well, I
yeah.
mean, I don't like it's kind of like yeah, people there's sort of two different variables going on with podcasts maybe. Like how like seriously informed they are. Like would you say like okay, that you probably could footnote. Um, and then there's like the ideology and sort of like Ezra Klein will give you like very good, it's footnotable. Yes, yes.
Hmm.
But then ideological, I mean, if you've ever listened to his interview with Noam Chomsky, it's like,
I
wow,
have
Ezra
actually,
Klein
yeah.
is really in like the American exceptionalism bubble.
And
Um,
on Ezra Klein, I have been like a little bit disappointed from some of the things he's said about Israel in terms of being. I don't want to label him with that, no, too much, but an interview he did, I was like, it seems more like a liberal form of Zionism to me rather than something like I kind of expected. I expected him. He was definitely critical of aspects of Israel, but I expected him to be more critical than he was on that topic too, from what I've listened to.
Yes, yes. So then that gets to the second dimension, this kind of like ideology. And I guess what I
Mhm.
like about what we now have with podcasts and YouTube is the ideological side is much easier to sample broadly and have people, yeah, like Joe Rogan, uh, who will not be sharing the same set of assumptions and the same of kind of like in a sort of Gramscian way. They won't be in the same under the same hegemonic influences as your standard, whether it's New York Times or NPR or just kind of the mainstream, I guess we'd say slightly left of center media outlets in the United States. So that can be, yeah. I mean, I think that's fundamental for remaining like well informed.
Yeah, I did, and you have touched on this a little bit. So again, you're predicting a Trump victory, and you've kind of got into how bad that could be. I guess just a couple of things I want to bring into that as well. We've been watching, me and Katie have been watching like an ABC, Australian ABC is like a government-funded broadcaster, a series, America's Last Election, and also, I know Katie was keen to ask, and again, you've touched this a bit already, but Trump's also said things like being open to using the military against the enemy within, and these kind of worrying thing, Project 2025, and those
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
things. So again,
yeah.
you've already covered it, but is there anything else you want to say about yeah, people having concerns that it won't just be, it's not just my candidate, but this is going to be, yeah, the end of democracy or the end of elections, etc.
Well, I think the if it was actually the end of democracy, I mean, it would be people like anyway, sort of people in my current of politics who would be the most threatened by it. It
Hmm.
wouldn't be the people in the mainstream who are saying it's going to be the end of democracy. I think most of those people would get along just fine.
Hmm.
They would become like loyal. They would become comfortable, collaborators with the regime. It's sort of the misfits, the outcasts, the extremists, the nonconformists who constitute the opposition in actual authoritarian situations. I don't know if you followed, but yesterday there was a pretty momentous event happening at the Washington Post. The Washington Post decided, maybe for the first time in their history, but definitely in a while, not to issue a presidential endorsement. So the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, and there is this decision to not endorse, basically to not endorse Kamala Harris, because that was the expectation, has in, shocked journalists across the country, and it's infuriated many of them, including people who work at the Post. And what's real, and here's where I get to this point about like who should be worried about authoritarianism. It's Bezos himself who changed the motto of the Washington Post in 2017 to "Democracy dies in darkness." So maybe it should have been "Democracy dies on spreadsheets," because it's now Bezos who's looking at the profitability of Amazon under a likely Trump administration and is thinking about potential antitrust regulation and how the federal government, which it's currently being pursued under Biden, but he's basically wagering that maybe Trump could drop the case. That's the working theory for why he wouldn't have why he would have leaned on the editors and broken the normal wall between owners and editors. You're supposed to have editorial independence in a paper, so that the paper would not issue an endorsement. So, from Democracy Dies in Darkness and this kind of like anti-Trump posture to now, capitulation, at a moment where if you're really concerned about a newspaper, at least, I don't know about, Amazon, but if you're concerned about a newspaper and you're concerned about your journalists, and you think Trump is a threat to democracy, then obviously you would want to endorse Kamala Harris and try to do whatever you can to help her win the election. So I just find a lot of this a rhetoric to be kind of unempirical as well as just politically self-serving, largely from liberals who don't are unwilling to make a political economic critique of Trump, because to really do that in a serious way would take them into the land of of Bernie Sanders. I mean, it would take them into the land of like really thinking about material inequality in the United States and what a serious program of redistribution would look like. And so, since they don't want to do political economy, they'll just stick with the kind of superficial regime, like this threat of a permanent, indefinite Trump regime coming to power. And I think, the proof of the pudding, or the ineffectiveness of that as a campaign strategy has shown in the way Trump has completely regained any ground that he had initially lost when Kamala Harris got the nomination.
And this is probably something we don't have to cover in as much detail because you don't think it's likely at this point. But I was wondering if Harris and Waltz do win, I guess, yeah, there are also concerns as well, like about, repeat of January 6th Capitol attacks, etc., or more generally just like denialism about the result, etc. So yeah, what are your thoughts about if it does go that way? Obviously, we can't know, but yeah, there could be concerns either way, I guess.
Yeah, well, in the American system, we do not have we don't really have a national election for president. We have these state level elections, which are selecting the electors. And so at the state level, when everything comes down to the electoral college, you do have the possibility for uncertainty and contestation and things being held up, especially if there are very narrow victory margins. I mean, it could be something as conventional as just asking for a recount, if that's what the state law requires, and the laws tend to vary from state to state. So first there's that, and I mean that like in the immediate days and a couple weeks after November 5th. I mean, even with Biden in 2020, it took we sort of knew within 24 hours that he was going to win, but it did take a few more days for it to play out. And so then after that, you get into the stage of Congress ratifying the Electoral College results. That's what happens on January 6th, 2 weeks before the inauguration of the president-elect. And, there I don't know what the scenarios are that people are bandying about look like, but I think it's unlikely that there would be some type of actual disruption of January 6, 2021 if Harris and Walz, actually win the elections. Basically, because I think it would probably have played out sooner than that if there was some type of challenge. But again, these states that if they win, they will be, they'll be in good shape, are largely controlled by Democratic governors. I mean, Pennsylvania has a Democratic governor, Michigan has a Democratic governor. I think Wisconsin has a Republican governor, although I would have to check that. But the states where things are more contentious, where like Arizona or Georgia, those are not necessary for Kamala Harris to get over 270. I'm sure unexpected things will happen. But the tricky thing is when they're probably not the things we didn't expect last time. So probably not exactly a repeat of January 6th. And maybe the polls won't be exactly as wrong as they were in 2016 and 2020. It will be good for Harris and Walz. Even if they lose, it'll be good for them if the polls are not underestimating Trump, because that will mean they performed better than otherwise. So that's kind of how my outlook right now. January, by the way, also January 6th, 2021, I'm not really in the camp that says like this was a coup attempt or this was, I really think there was not an existential threat to the US system of government on that day. And I think it could have been prevented with more serious policing just at the Capitol. Also, though, this time you do have a Democratic administration in place, so it's a little different to the extent that January 6th was exacerbated, if not, instigated, but by a Republican president who had a fundamental, we could say, conflict of interest, or at least had a fundamental desire to see some chaos on that day. Biden and Harris don't want to see chaos on that day, especially not if Harris is the president-elect. So in that sense, it's easier to see, the handoff happening.
Great. Yeah, I think that will probably be a good chance to wrap up. I'll hand over to you to say anything you haven't got to that you'd like to, any links you'd like people to look into, whether it's from something you've done or others. We will put links in the show notes to the article we mentioned, Who's Afraid of Democracy by Steve Fraser, which I think goes into depth in terms of that issue of not just saying Trump's a danger to democracy, but actually giving some kind of alternative for the Democrats. And also we'll put a link to your article on The Statesman about the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. But yeah, any final thoughts or anything you'd like listeners to check out before we go?
Well, I would say that I feel like we're living in this era of, it's a shorthand, but we'll just say era of neoliberalism, definitely since the 1990s. And was it Margaret Thatcher said, there's no alternative, and our greatest victory was getting Tony Blair to embrace our ideas. Well, that goes for the Democrats too. And so Trump and what Sanders did over the past decade or so is say well, there should be an alternative. There should be some kind of alternative. And that's why Trump has gotten traction. And at this point in 2024, the polls are showing that the deficit that Biden had among American voters without a college education, so some level of education less than a college degree, his deficit to Trump in that area demographic was 20 in 2020 was something like 4 points. It's now roughly doubled. I think I've seen in some places at 7%, some places higher than that, between Kamala and Trump. And that says a lot about what's happening with the Democratic Party. So we shouldn't gainsay that there's prejudice out there, there's misogyny, there's racism, there's all kinds of bigotry. And that's something that Trump and the Republican Party have long played to. But they weren't able to win elections the way they've been able to win elections recently with just some really egregiously right-wing domestic politics, and with this type of support among a broad number of Americans, including improving their support among non-white voters. So I think the Democrats fundamentally would need to do some basic restructuring of their party platform and their party agenda if they come out on the losing end of this election. And maybe it'll be the kind of shock that they need to do that. I hope it doesn't just descend into a kind of superficial dissection of the Harris-Waltz campaign.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for coming on the show today. Thanks for giving up your time for the show. Always nice to have you on, and thanks for all your insights today.
Yeah, my pleasure. And anyway, I hope I'm wrong.
Yep. And thanks for listening, and thanks to watching online, anyone who's watching on the YouTube as well.